Today's daf we're going to be learning is Avodah Zarah Daf Vav. This is the daf for Tisha B'av. As I mentioned before, the custom is not to learn Torah on Tisha B'av, so you can either learn it before, you can learn it after, or do whatever your custom is. So we're going to get started now with, we've almost finished this. We really kind of did finish this back and forth, but we have one last point to do between Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, and the rabbis and their position about particularly is if you planted the tree for the permitted purposes, do we view that as mechubar lakarka, and therefore it's like the mountains and it's not going to be forbidden to benefit from? Or, right, even if it was later worshipped, or according to Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, it's going to be forbidden anyway. Okay, you're forbidden to worship it because, it's forbidden to benefit from. Okay, even though it was planted for the proper reasons, still we're going to say the tree is forbidden. Now we said, and that's because the tree has to be sat yad adam. Remember, there's human involvement in there. So it's different from the mountain and the hills. And then we had the last ping pong between them. Where they learn from this pasuk, where they learn from that pasuk. We had this explanation, and we ended with Rabbi Akiva's explanation that what is ibadat shema? It must be lechanot lashem. You have to call it a different name. And that's a way of wiping out the name entirely. To which the Braita continues and says, Yachol Shevach, maybe you could change it to a nice name, you might have thought. So the Gemara says, why would you have thought, oh, let's change it to a really nice, respectful name? Well, Ella, what they really meant to ask in the Braita was, Yachol lo l'shevach v'lo l'gnai. Could it be that you could change the name either to a positive or to a negative connotation name? Talmud Lomar. Well, we learn from the pasuk. You can't do this. This is how the Braita continues. Shaketz to shaksenu v'ta'ev to ta'avenu ki cheremhu. You have to completely despise it, and that means give it a despicable name. So, for example, haketzad. The Braita brings some examples. Hayu korino ta beit galia. If it was called beit galia, korino ta beit karya. What's beit karya? Rashi explains. Karya is to dig, so it could be from the language of digging and depths, like something humiliating underground. Pnei Melech, the face of a king. Pnei Kelev, instead of calling it the face of a king, they called it the face of a dog. Ein Kol, right, the eye of all, like the eye that sees everything. Ein Kotz, like thorny eyes. Okay, now we're going to move on to another question, and we're going to get back to this machloka Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, and the rabbis. Tani Kamei Rav Sheshet. So a Tana, one of the people who memorized Braitot, brought a Braita in front of Rav Sheshet. Hagoyim ha'ovdim et ha'arim ve'et ha'gvaot. So these Gentiles that worship the mountains and the hills, hein mutarim va'ovdehem b'sayif. So they're permitted, but those who worship it actually get killed by the sword. Because anyone who does, if you remember from Sanhedrin, the basic opinion is, even though there's a debate about it, if you do any of the mitzvot b'nei Noach, you go against the Noachide laws, you're deserving of death by the sword. If you remember, Jews who worship idols get stoned, but Gentiles get the sword. If you bow down to things that are growing, vegetation, hein asulim, v'ovdehem b'sayif. Again, now in this case, even the vegetables, anything growing from the ground is forbidden. Okay, this is like we said before, because there's human involvement in it. And those who worship them will also get sayif, will also get the sword, killed by the sword. Amarle, so Rav Sheshet said to this person who was bringing the Braita, Amar lechamane. Who's this according to? Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, he Amar ilan shenita'ol vasof avdo asur. So he says it's Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, because what we're talking about here are Zra'im, things that were planted for permitted purposes, and then later they worship them, and that's why they're forbidden, right? And even that case is forbidden, and even that case is forbidden would be, right, even that case is forbidden would be Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, okay? Whereas, remember, obviously, if they were planted for the purposes of Avodah Zarah, they'd be forbidden. But if they were planted for permitted purposes, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda forbids this. So now the Gemara, so either Rav Sheshet asked, what the Gemara asked, why didn't you say that it was a case of, maybe it was just like the tree, this stuff was grown for the purposes of idol worship. And then you could have said it fits with the rabbi's position. You wouldn't have to say only Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yehuda's, and everyone agrees with that. So they say, lo sakadatach. No, we didn't think to say that. Why? Dekatane dumia dahar. Because this Braita puts up two cases next to each other. One is the mountains and the hills, and the other is this case of the of the stuff growing for the ground. Now, the assumption is since they're parallel, they must have something similar about them. Now, what do we know about a har? No har was created for the purposes of idol worship. So mahar shalom lekach. The har wasn't planted for idol worship purposes. Also, this was planted not for that intent in mind. Okay? And therefore, it must be Rabbi Yehuda's position that it was planted for permitted purposes and then became worshipped later. Now we're going to get to a machloket between the sons of Rabbi Chia, who are Chizkiah and Yehuda, and Rabbi Yochanan. Okay, it's important to know it's Chizkiah because Chizkiah is going to come up later when we try to determine who said what. Because right now we don't know who said what. And the topic is of Nehar Nidal Delu. We have rocks that rolled off the mountain. Okay, so they were attached, right? And then they came off the mountain and they're now separate from the mountain. B'nei Rabbi Chia, I would like to call these the rolling stones. It's a good way to remember the sugya. It's the rolling stone sugya. So we have these rocks that rolled down. B'nei Rabbi Chia Rabbi Yochanan, Chanamar Surot, v'Chanamar Mutarot. We all know that mountains start falling apart, and then we start to get rocks formed, and they become detached. So now the question is, since they're detached now, are they forbidden or not? So one says forbidden, one says permitted. My time a demand amar mutarot. What's the logic for saying they're permitted? So this is going to take us a little bit of time, and there's a study guide for today I forgot to mention. You can look here and it charts it out. So the reason to say they're permitted is like this: kihar, like a mountain. Mahar she'ein bo tfisat yadei adam mutal. Well, the mountain itself had no human involvement, and therefore it's permitted. Afhane she'ein bein tfisat yadei adam umutarim. These also have no human involvement in them, and therefore they're permitted. But they say that doesn't really work because a har is different. Because the obvious reason. Malahar shekem chubar. Har is attached. Right? So, and this is not attached. So you would think because it's not attached, maybe it's forbidden. So now they say, but wait, not everything that's attached, just because it's attached doesn't mean it's forbidden. It's just because it's attached. Sorry, just because it's detached doesn't mean we're going to say it's forbidden. An animal will prove, because an animal also that's worshipped, even though it's detached from the ground, does not become an idol, okay, and is not permitted to benefit from. And that's because an animal is significant in and of itself, and you can't just turn it into an idol, just like you can't turn a mountain into an idol. So they're going to say, because look, the har is not man-made, neither is an animal, and the har might be attached, and these stones are detached, but the behemah will prove that you can be detached and also still be permitted and not be able to be turned into an idol. But what's the problem? But an animal has life in it, and it's an animal. It lives. The rocks don't live, and maybe that's why. So the mountain has the issue that it's attached, and that's why it's permitted. And the animal is the issue that's alive, and that's why it's permitted. So you can't learn in either of those, right? The rocks are not similar to either one of those. But they say, what do you mean? Har yochiach v'chazar adin. In other words, this is a classic case where we say, we can learn from the least common denominator between the two. Because even though an animal is alive, but the mountain isn't. And even though the mountain is attached, but the animal isn't. So lo re'izeh, this one's not like that one. The lo re'izeh, and that one's not like the other one. Hatzara shevesh behen. So what's the least common denominator? She'ein behem tfisat yedei adam. There's no human involvement in their creation. Umutar, and they're permitted. So great. Af kol she'ein behem tfisat yedei adam, like these rolling stones that have no human involvement. Umutar, and it's permitted. But wait a minute. This doesn't really work because the least common denominator there is not the same as the least common denominator by the stones. Why not? But the mountain and the animal haven't changed. They're the same. But the rock has changed. It was part of the mountain. Now it's not. It's a stone. So you can't learn it from there. However, you could learn it from two other similar things. We're going to do a minor variations here. You could take an animal that's blemished and a mountain. The animal that's blemished is also not going to be forbidden if it becomes an idol. And if you take that together with the mountain, so the blemished animal has changed, and yet it's still going to not be forbidden. And also the mountain, right? And again, you're going to have the least common denominator between the two. Neither of, right? Now we have a case where you could have it that it changed, and therefore you could learn from there, even though it changed, it's still going to be permitted. Inami, alternatively, you could say, Mi behemat me'al milan yavesh. You could say you could learn it from an unblemished animal, which isn't changed, but from a tree that dried out, which also changed. So it's attached to the ground, but it changed, and yet it's still permitted, even though it changed. And then you can see that that's not a factor that's going to say, oh, because of that, it must be forbidden. So you can learn from either those two or those two. Now, that was all to explain the one who permits. Manda asar, the one who forbids. This will be a little simpler. That's why it repeats this idea about shaketz tishaksenu. There's a double language of each one, and there's a doubling of the, right? Both are, you should completely despise these things. Even though you could come up with a logical explanation, which we just did in the previous example, where we said, oh, logic would say that just like the mountain, just like the animal, this should be also permitted, to lehatir, to permit it, lo tatya. But comes the pasuk to say, no, 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 despise them completely. And there are cases that you might have thought we could learn it out that are going to be permitted, but they're not. And that's why the rolling stones at the end, according to this interpretation, are forbidden. Now we're going to try to figure out who says what. Tistaim de b'nei Rabbi Chia deshan. Let's try to infer that the sons of Rabbi Chia are the ones who permitted. Why? It's all going to be based on this question Rabbi Chia asks about an egg. Zakaf beitza. Now, a beitza is going to be similar to these rolling stones. Why is that? Because the egg comes out of the hen, okay, which is an animal, which is permitted, as does the stone comes from the mountain, which is permitted, and it has no human involvement. But if zakaf beitza, if a human got involved in it and put it up, okay, to stand it up as an idol, lihishtachavola, to bow down to it, what's the halacha? That was Chizkiah's question. Remember, he's one of the sons of Rabbi Chia. So now it's going to take us a little while to get to this proof, but we're going to try to prove, in the end we're going to reject it, but we're going to try to prove that they hold that it's permitted. Then we're going to reject it and say, no, they actually hold it's forbidden. But let's start with the first. Kasalkadatach. Now, when they heard Chizkiah's question, they thought that what he meant was not just that you set it up to bow down to it, but it's kasalkadatach, sorry, lishtachavola vehishtachavala, that you set it up to bow down to, and you actually bow down to it. V'kamebayele, haizikifata, iavimase, ilo avimase. And then what the question is this considered human involvement? Because even though there was no human involvement in its creation, there was human involvement in standing it up and putting up as an idol. Is that considered human involvement or no? Now, that's the question. Okay, so what does that have to do with us? Well, avalosakaf. Well, what if the person hadn't set it up? Lo mitasra. Obviously, it wouldn't be forbidden then, right? Because the question is only once there's human involvement, would that make it forbidden? But it's obvious from here that if there's no human involvement for this egg, right, then if there's no human involvement, then it's not forbidden. And as we said, that's comparable to this case of the rolling stones. To which the Gemara says, "Look, that's not true. No, no, no. They really forbid. And why? Because you misunderstood the question. Now, before we explain the question, they're going to say, they hold that if you bow down to it, actually, even if you didn't pick it up, by bowing down alone to this, makes it an idol, and it's forbidden the egg. But and that's because it's detached already. Okay, we don't view it as, oh, it came from the animal and there was no human involvement. Even without human involvement, just by bowing to it, you made it an idol, and it's forbidden. So then, what's the question that Chizkiah asked? You actually set it up. Chizkiah's question is, if I set up this egg, I stood it up to bow down to, but I never bowed down to it. Now, according to that, that's his question. Now, the problem is, the Gemara is going to say, there's no question there. It's obvious what the answer is. It depends whether you're Rabbi Ishmael or you're Rabbi Akiva, because they debate this issue elsewhere. Okay, and now we're going to see on Daf Nun Aleph, there's a machloket. Ulaman, according to is the question. Meaning, it doesn't fit according to either opinion. There's no question. It's obvious. Leman da Amar, which is Rabbi Ishmael, Avodah Zarah shel Yisrael asura miyad. If there's an idol that a Jew set up as an idol, even though he never worshipped it yet, it's forbidden immediately. By you designating this as an idol, it's forbidden. Well, then it should be forbidden, asura, and obviously the egg is forbidden. And ilaman damar aj te'aved. And according to Rabbi Akiva, the one who says, until you actually worship it, it won't be forbidden until it's worshipped. Halo palchat, you didn't worship it. So of course it's not forbidden. And then it would be obvious the answer is it's permitted. So it can't be that was his question. So lo tzricha, we're going to have a third way to read this. I just want to point out this egg situation, and I underlined this on the sheet. Option one is to say that the question about the egg was you stood it up to worship and you worshiped it. Now we say you stood it up to worship but didn't yet worship it. Okay, but now we say that doesn't work either because it's then obvious. Either you're Rabbi Ishmael or you're Rabbi Akiva, and then the answer that Chizkiah would have had would be obvious. Either holds like Rabbi Ishmael or he holds like Rabbi Akiva, and there should be no question. So now we're going to understand it a third way. But within that, we're going to understand it still that if you actually worshipped it, it would definitely be forbidden, even though there was no human involvement, right? Even if it wasn't stood up, because that's what's inferred here. And then Bnei Rabbi Chia really they must be the ones who forbid. But let's get to our third explanation, Lutzricha, and that we did already. That's why I'm reviewing it, because that's irrelevant to this at this point. Lotzricha, what the question is kigon shezakat beitzal ishtachavola v'lo ishtachavola, which we already explained. You set it up to worship it, you didn't yet worship it, but it's a little bit more, and that's why it's not Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Ishmael. Rabbi Kiva and Rabbi Ishmael, because ba'ovei kochavim v'ishtachavola, but a Gentile came by and worshipped it. Now it's yours. Generally, we say someone can't forbid something that's not their own. However, you already designated it to be an idol, so by him bowing down, that perhaps makes it forbidden. And now the question is this, okay? Now, that theoretically should make it forbidden, but here we're going to have a particular question because it's an egg. So, Kihada Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel. Well, this fits with what Rav Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel about a different case, and Chizki's question is, do we apply this as well to the egg case? So the case he brings up is this. Yisrael shezakaf levena. I took a brick, which normally the bricks go the long way, okay, horizontally. But I picked it up and stood it up vertically. Lishtachavot la, to bow down to it. Ubao ve'kochavim, v'ishtachavala, and a Gentile comes along and bows to it, asura. It's forbidden. Now, here comes the question. Kamibayli, they ask the question, this is what Chizkiah's question is, Livenahu deminkras kifata. A livena, it's very obvious that when I stood it up, I was doing something different and I was setting it up to be an idol. So it's very noticeable. And that's why when the Gentile comes and worships it, it's obvious that that's what I meant to do originally, and therefore it turns it into an idol. Aval beitza lo, but maybe an egg is not the same because it's not so noticeable when you stand up an egg. It's not like a big noticeable thing. First of all, it's pretty small and it's not so noticeable and it's not so clear that I was doing it for idol worship. Odil malo shnauer, maybe it's the same. Teku. And that ends without an answer. We don't have an answer to Chizkiah's question. But again, the point being, if it had actually been worshipped by the Jew, even without standing it up, it would obviously be forbidden. Because that's not even what Chizkiah was talking about. He was talking about if it hadn't been worshipped. If it had been worshipped, of course it's forbidden. And then that's Chizkiah, which is the Bnei Rabbi Chia. And then Rabbi Yochanan would be the one, obviously, who permitted. Next question. By Rami Braham, Hamishtachaven lahal. If you bow down to a mountain, avanav mahu lamizbech. There's one thing about saying maybe the stones aren't forbidden to benefit, but the question is, can you use them on the altar? So once the har was bowed down to, can you take stones off that? This isn't stones that fell. This is taking stones from the mountain and using them to build an altar, which is like sanctified, right? That's already much more difficult to say. So here comes the Gemara and suggests on Amud Bet, here comes the question. Do we say, yesh ne'ebad b'mechubar etzel gavoa, or ein ne'ebad b'mechubar etzel gavoa? Here's the big question. If you take an animal, we said already an animal is not forbidden to benefit from if someone makes it into an idol. However, you cannot take an idol that was worshipped and bring it as a sacrifice on the altar. So the question is, number one, is there a din of nevad? Nevad means something that was worshipped, like the mountain. Would that be forbidden then? It's a gavoa for you to put this on the altar. Or maybe we don't say that. And within that, we have a further question. If you say there is a law of nevad, what it means there is nevad means it would be forbidden. Nevad means if we say the law is, well, this was worshipped, I can't bring this on the altar. So if you say there is such a thing for even things that were attached to the ground, not just for animals, but for stones that were attached to the ground, Well, that's what we talked about it for animals. We talked about offering it as a sacrifice. That might be different from building an altar out of it, because that's what we call machshirei korban. Do we say machshirei korban ke korban damu? Oh, no. Do we say the things that enable the sacrifice are like the sacrifice itself, or perhaps not? So I'm a Rav. Rav is going to answer with a kal vachomer. And then Rav Huna B'Reid Rav Yeshua is going to try to reject his kal vachomer and say, I'm going to take your kal vachomer, flip it on its head, and show you something absurd comes out of your kal vachomer to say, don't try to make kal vachomers like that. And you're going to see the kal vachomer is not really so logical. It's just kind of kal vachomer like, well, if this is that, then that is that. Okay? And that's really why it seems that we're going to reject this kal vachomer. So Rava says kal vachomer. Here's the kal vachomer. ומה אתנן שמותר בתלוש להדיוט אסור במחובר לגבוה דכתיב לא תביא אתנן זונה על מחיר כלב. Now we're going to start our kal vachomer with the etnan and get there to the nevad. Etnan is a gift of a prostitute. A prostitute gives, someone gives a gift to a prostitute for prostitution, and then somebody wants to take that gift, right? The woman got it for as prostitute. She wants to take it and use it on the altar. Now, it says you cannot bring etnan zona or mechir kelev. You can't use the money you got for a sale of a dog or the etnan of a zona, bigavoa. Okay, now, Rava's kal vachomer starts like this. An etnan, now a gift from a prostitute, is mutar b'talush lehedyot. If it's detached from the ground, which doesn't really matter, attached or detached, but we're going to see where we're going to get this way. If it's detached and you give it to a regular person, there's nothing forbidden about it. It's not a forbidden item. It's only a problem for the altar. And yet, asur b'mechubar legavoa. And yet, when it comes to something that's attached to the ground, that's an etnan, even attached to the ground, because we think even attached to the ground is more likely to be permitted from our sugya for Avodah Zarah. But here, even attached to the ground, it's going to be forbidden to use on the altar. Dichtiv, how do we know that? Because it says, Lo tavi etnan zona b'chir kelev, lo shna talush lo shna b'chubar. The pasuk doesn't distinguish between attached, detached. So therefore, any gift from a prostitute is not going to be able to go on the altar, even though when it's detached, it's permitted, and even attached really, it's permitted to a regular person. So now we're going to make our jump. If we have something that's permitted b'talush to a regular person, let's go to the nevad. Now, nevad, something that was worshipped, that's talush, detached, like an idol, for example. Nevad, she'asur b'talush lahedyot. Now, a hedyot can't benefit from that. We can't benefit from something detached. Ein odin she'asur b'mechubar legavoa. Well, then take our thing. So now you have to, again, go back to the words, and I kind of highlighted them and underlined them on the sheet. But we have something that's permitted to an individual, which is detached, that's the etnan, and forbidden when it's it's permitted when it's detached for a regular person. It's forbidden when it's attached, even when it's attached to the altar. So take the nevad, which is forbidden to an individual, right? Not even in the temple. It's forbidden to any individual because it was worshipped. If it's detached, then all the more so, ein odin, wouldn't you say then, based on this kal vachomer again, it's not really logical, but that it will be a forbidden nevad if it's attached, even if it's attached, it'll be forbidden to be used on the altar. That's the kal vachomer. Okay, very, very, not so logical as I would say, but sort of cut and dry. These words, those words, those words, that words. Okay, without getting into really the logic behind anything. So Amalei Rav Huna B'Reid Rav Yeshua, which makes sense that Rav Huna B'Reid Rav Yeshua is now going to come and question Rabba and say, "Oh chiluf, what do you mean? You could say the reverse. You could start with the nevan and come to a ridiculous conclusion about an etnan." So let's see. Uma nevad shasur b'talush etzel hedyot and mutar b'mechubar legavoa. Now, in general, what do we say about things that are attached? Generally, they're permitted. So let's go like this: things that were worshipped that are forbidden to an individual when they're detached. Perhaps when they're attached, they're actually permitted, even though they're detached, and you're just using it for an individual. It's forbidden to benefit from. That's regular Avodah Zarah. And yet, when they're attached to the ground, they're permitted even for the altar. Shenemal, how do we get it? Because of the pasuk, Elohim alarim, velo harim Elohim. Right? They're not considered nevad if they're the mountain themselves, if they're attached. The loshna hedyot, loshna gavoa. It didn't seem to distinguish. It just says it's not an idol. It doesn't matter whether it's for God or whether, right, for the altar or whether it's for any purpose. So therefore, in etnan, shemutar b'talush. Now, etnan is going to be much more lenient because the etnan already is permitted when it's detached for a regular person. It's permitted no matter what for a regular person. So ein odin, if it's already got a lenient halacha here, Maybe if it's attached to the ground, in the case of Avodah Zarah, we're going to be lenient. So maybe in the case of Etnan, if it's attached to the ground, we're going to be lenient and you can offer it up to God. And that obviously would be ridiculous. Nobody thinks you can take a gift for a prostitute that have because it's attached to the ground, you're going to allow it. So he basically says, I could take your cup of home, flip it on its head, and come to a ridiculous conclusion, basically knocking out his cup of home. But he adds, if you want to say, well, maybe it says specifically by Etnan, Beit Hashem Elokecha, and that would mean anytime you're bringing anything to the temple. Well, no, because those words are needed for some other drasha. They're needed for this drasha. Okay, there's two possible drasha. Beit Hashem Elokecha, Prat Para She'ena Ba'al Habayit. The Parah Aduma was done on Har HaZeitim, Mount of Olives. And because of that, it's not a problem if you use, now it would be crazy to think about this, but if you use a Parah Aduma from the gift of a prostitute, it's not Beit Hashem, it's not the house of God. Divrei Rabbi Eliezer. That's Rabbi Eliezer's drasha. Chachamim omrim lerabot et harikuim. These are all these decorative elements that were made of gold. I think they're what they're actually called, but anyway, these rikuim, that's what he uses it for. That anything in the temple is a problem. I'll look up the English word for that. Right, it's the beaten plates of gold that were used in the temple. Okay, they hang in the temple. These beaten plates, gold. So that can't be used from En Zona because it happens to be in Beit Hashem. Anything in Beit Hashem, not just a sacrifice. Okay, so those are two different possible drashot from Beit Hashem. So they review, Rehuna Beri Rav Yeshua points out, don't question me from that to knock out my Kavach Homer, because I said you could theoretically bring from Mechubar and En Zona, right? If it was Mechubar to the temple, based on, again, the ridiculous Kavach Homer, it's not true, but don't knock me out for Beit Hashem L'kecha, because that was used for a different drashot. So Amrle, Rava says back to him, Ana kamina l'chumra, va'atamra l'kula. Wait a minute. I brought my kavachomer to be stringent, right? I said, you can't do the nadvad, that's mechubar. And you tried to bring a kula that you can bring a gift of a prostitute to the temple, if it's mechubar, right? If it's attached. But kula v'chomer l'chula v'harchina. If you have an option to do a kavachomer and you want to knock it out, you can only knock it out if you have a more strict way of reading the Kavachomer. You can't say, oh, I have a leniency. I can make the Kavachomer flip and do it to the lenient direction, because you don't do that. When you want to knock out a Kavachomer, you can only say, I have a stricter interpretation. You can't say I have a more lenient interpretation. And that's a rule. So basically, he says, you can't knock out my Kavachomer with your ridiculous Kavachomer by flipping it, because you're flipping it Lakula, and we don't do that kind of thing. So now, Rav Papa says to Rava, are you sure you can't do that? I'm going to show you an example where somebody does do it, Lakula. They knock out a cup of chomer by saying, hey, I can take a cup of chomer and come to a ridiculous conclusion that would be more lenient. And it works. So let's see. In the end, we'll reject it, but let's see it. So Rav Papa says, when someone does it one way and someone does it right strict, and when the other one is more lenient, we can't knock it out with the more lenient one. The case of sprinkling on Pesach. Now, let's say you have to do the Korban Pesach, and you're impure, and you need to sprinkle on day 3 and day 7. Now, not sprinkling on Shabbat is not permitted. It's a derabbanan. Okay, it's only also permitted from the rabbis by rabbinic law, but it's not allowed to be done on Shabbat. The question is, if you don't do your sprinkling on day 3 and 7, and it comes out, one of them comes out on Shabbat, you're going to be delayed, and it's going to delay you to the extent that you won't be able to bring the Korban Pesach. So if we're going to be strict, what we're going to say is doing the sprinkling on Pesach, on Shabbat, is permitted in order to allow you to bring the Korban Pesach, because you actually have to bring the Korban Pesach. That would be the strict approach. The lenient approach would be to say, no, it doesn't override Shabbat. You don't have to do it. You'll end up still being impure on Pesach, and you'll be exempt from the Korban Pesach. That would be the lenient, because it leads you to an exemption of the Korban Pesach. So now we're going to see that Rabbi Eliezer had the more strict approach. Rabbi Akiva comes and flips his Kal Chomer and gives a more lenient reading of it. And Rabbi Akiva rejects Rabbi Eliezer, which would show that you can reject it with an easy explanation, with, the more lenient explanation. So let's see inside. So Hazav Pesach, where Rabbi Eliezer, Pligi Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Akiva, they disagree. Rabbi Eliezer Savar Lechumra. Rabbi Eliezer holds stringently. Okay, we're going to read it now inside in Rashi, because it doesn't bring it in the Gemara. To Rabbi Eliezer down Lechumra, I'm in Rashi. Dekatani Amar Rabbi Eliezer, ve'aleha anidan. I have a Kal Chomer. Uma shchita shehi mishum malacha. Now, shchita is one of the malachot. It's forbidden by Torah law. and yet dochet to Shabbat, or do the Korban Pesach, it overrides Shabbat. If it comes out on Pesach, you do it. Right, your Dali comes out on Pesach, you do the Korban Pesach. On Shabbat, you do the Korban Pesach. So what do you all the more so think that the sprinkling, which is only rabbinic, you should override? And then you'll be chayav in Pesach, and that's the strict way of reading it. So again, let's go back to the Gemara. Rabbi Eliezer savar l'chumra become a chayav lagavra, right? And he made the person be obligated in the Korban Pesach. Rabbi Akiva lekula upater. Rabbi Akiva went lekula and exempted. The kaparach Rabbi Akiva lekula, and Rabbi Akiva, how did he knock out the kavachomer? Because he flipped it on its head and said you could do it the reverse and come to a ridiculous conclusion. That would be a lenient approach. And then we ruled like Rabbi Akiva. Ditnan, how do we know this? It says in a Mishnah, Heshiv Rabbi Akiva, O chiluf. I could do the opposite, Rabbi Akiva said. You could say, Ma haza'ah, start with haza'ah, exactly as we did before. Flip it. Haza'ah shi mishum shvut and adoche Shabbat. Now, let's start with saying it doesn't override Shabbat. Now, haza'ah, which is only rabbinic, doesn't override Shabbat. Shchita, shi deoraita lo koshkim. What do you think that slaughtering, which is by Torah law, forbidden? What do you think all the more so? It doesn't override Shabbat. And then you would come to the conclusion that you don't slaughter the Korban Pesach on Shabbat, which isn't true. And based on that, he says, since I'm going to knock out your kavachomer by flipping it, basically you don't do the hazah. You're going to go lekula and you're not going to do the hazah. It's not going to override Shabbat. And then you're not going to be able to bring the Korban Pesach, and that's going to be a lenient law because you don't have to bring the Korban Pesach. So now they say, okay, but there you see that you can flip a kavachomer, do it leniently, and we're going to rule like you. So they say, no. There was a side reason. Why do we go like Rabbi Akiva? Not because he flipped the kavachomer. Okay? There's a different reason. Hatam Rabbi Eliezer Gambri. Really, Rabbi Eliezer already had taught this halacha. And Rabbi Eliezer had taught it like Rabbi Akiva said it, not like Rabbi Eliezer said it. Rabbi Eliezer had actually taught that haza'ah, the sprinkling, despite the fact that it's rabbinic law, and only forbidden by rabbinic law to do on Shabbat, it still doesn't override Shabbat. And iyakir le Talmuda, but he forgot that he had taught that. And Rabbi Akiva wanted to remind him of what he himself had taught. And Rabbi Akiva was just reminding him by bringing this, knocking out his kavachomer. But that's not really the reason why we held like Rabbi Akiva. And this is what he said to him. Rabbi, my rabbi, he said to Rabbi Eliezer, don't deny what I have to say when we get up against each other and argue Torah. Because I learned from you the following. Haza'ah is only forbidden by rabbinic law, and yet it doesn't override Shabbat. Okay, we don't do it, and you're exempt from the Korban Pesach, and you yourself taught it to me. So this doesn't knock out what Rav said, that basically don't knock me out with your kavachomer, because we don't go when there's a chomer and a kula, we don't go flip the kavachomer to be the kula way, we keep it the chomer way. And that's how Rav approved what Rav Sheshet's, right, he brought an answer to Rav Sheshet's question, where again, what did Rav say in the end? Rav Sheshet wanted to know if there's neva b'mechubar by the mizbeach, and he said yes. Even, right, the stones that were in this mountain that was worshipped, the stones are forbidden to be used on the altar, which makes sense, because anything connected with idol worship, we don't really want it on the altar. It doesn't seem right. Okay, bye, Rami Bar Chama. Last question for today. We'll start this today. Someone bows to a row of wheat. Can you use it for menachot? So again, it was attached to the ground, and now we want to use it for menachot. The big issue here is that when we turn it into flour, we already change it from its original form. So this is something we talked about a lot in Bava Kama, for example, and comes up in many sugyot about how shinoi changes something. So yesh shinoi b'nevad or ain't shinoi b'nevad? Is shinoi functional in something that was nevad to change its status from something that was worshipped to now we're going to permit it because it's already in a different form? Or do we not say that? So Amar Marzitra Berei Rav Nachman Tashma. Marzitra says in the name of Rav Nachman, let's learn from here. Kol asulim l'gabei mizbech v'ladotehem mutarim. Anything that's forbidden on the altar, their offspring is permitted. V'tanei Allah, Rabbi Eliezer osel. And it says there that Rabbi Eliezer forbids. There's a bright time that says Rabbi Eliezer forbids. Basically, what we're going to say is the vlad is like a change, right, for something that was ne'abad. It's like something that comes out of it. And therefore, what do we see here? It's a machloket tanaim, and that's the answer. It depends which Tanaitic position you hold by. Okay, but then we're going to question that, and that's going to get really into tomorrow's stuff, so we're going to stop here. So let's go back and just review. We had number one, getting rid of idols, and we have to change their names. And then we talked about how do we change their names. It has to be a despicable name. From there, we went to this Braita they brought to Rav Sheshet, and then we attributed it to Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, with the Nevad, right? It was planted first for the right reason, right? For not idol worship purposes, and then it became idol worshipped, and then we're going to say it's still forbidden. And then we had this Rolling Stones question. Is it forbidden? Is it permitted? We had the reasons why each one says forbidden, permitted. And then we went to explain who holds what. We first tried one based on the egg, standing up the egg, but then we said we didn't really understand the question the Chizkiah asked there, and we're going to actually say the question was something else, and then infer the opposite, that really they're the ones who forbade. Then we had the question of Rami Bar Chama, are you allowed to use stones that were attached to a mountain that was worshipped in the altar, which in the end we concluded no, even though we had Rav Huna, we tried to flip the Kal Vachomer, but we said, no, you can't flip a Kal Vachomer that way, and then we went into that. Is that really true? What about Rabbi Kiva, Rabbi Eliezer? But we resolved that. And then we ended with this question about what about can you use for a mincha offering, which again is something we offer on the altar. If it was someone bowed to the wheat, but then we turned it into flour, is shinoi effective or not? And then we saw that it was a machloka between Tanaim, and we'll continue that sugya tomorrow. Wishing everyone a good fast, and may we hear good news soon.